Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 255. What goes into crafting an effective Python script? How do you organize your code, manage dependencies using PEP 723, and handle command line arguments for the best results? Christopher Trudeau is back on the show this week, bringing another batch of PyCoder's weekly articles and projects. We dig into a recent Real Python article about how to structure your Python scripts. It includes advice for adding inline script metadata as defined in PEP 723, which helps tools automatically create an environment and install dependencies when the script is run. The piece also covers choosing appropriate data structures, improving runtime feedback, and making your code more maintainable with constants and entry points. We discuss a collection of software trends happening behind the scenes of the constant LLM news. The piece starts with local-first software, prioritizing processing and storing private data on personal devices rather than relying on the cloud. The other trends include common themes and tools we've shared over the past few years, including WebAssembly, SQLite's renaissance, and the improvements to cross-platform mobile development. We also share several other articles and projects from the Python community, including a news roundup, the state of free-threaded Python, improving Django management commands, advice for time management as a manager, a data science-focused IDE, and a project to check for multiple patterns in a single string. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Christopher, welcome back.
Hey there.
So I have a real quick follow-up thing from 2 weeks ago. We were talking a lot about Marimo again, and friend of the show, I shall call him now because he's emailed me a couple times, Akshay Agrawal, guy kind of behind Marimo there, said, hey, you guys, that $ thing is from LaTeX, or I always want to pronounce it LaTeX because that's how it's spelled, LATEX. And so they implement that sort of $ notation for mathematical formulas, and that's, again, from LaTeX. So quick follow-up on that. Thanks, Akshay. And yeah, I am interested in having you come back on the show, and I'll have to figure out how we're going to do that. So to talk more, because there's been a lot of development there. But we have our usual news, actually quite a bit of release news and other stuff happening. And our topics, a discussion this week, and some fun projects. So let's dig in. You ready for the news?
Yeah, for sure. I'm starting to look forward to the summer lull. There's just so much news.
Yep.
Let's get started with PEP 734, which got accepted. This one is called Multiple Interpreters in the Stdlib, and it's part of the ongoing work with sub-interpreters. This is slotted for Python 3.14 and will include a module in Python itself for accessing info about the interpreters. Up until now, that's only been available at the C extension level. So this is bringing it up into the core language parts. Next, we've got a bunch of release news. Get ready for a barrage of version numbers. There was a security release for Python giving us 3.13.4, 3.12.11, 3.11.13, 3.10.18, and 3.9.23.
Bingo!
Most of that was your typical security fix stuff. Then 8 days later, 3.13.5 came out, rolling back a couple of the changes from 3.13.4 and fixing a few other things. If that's not enough to top that all off, then 3.14 Beta 3 came out as well. So it's been a busy week for Python releases.
Yeah, definitely.
And not to be outdone, there was another Django security release. This is a follow-on fix to the previous one that we talked about a couple of weeks ago with a potential log injection vulnerability. They just sort of cranked it down a little more and tightened up the security. If you're tracking along at home, that gives you 5.2.3, 5.1.11, and 4.2.23. Next up, NumPy 2.3.0. This adds capabilities for free-threaded Python and a new function for slicing string arrays. And I'm still not done. There was also a scikit-learn release 1.7. Lots of new stuff in here, including a bunch of work on the array API. All right, that's the release news. One other small shout out, which is the recordings from PyData Virginia are now out on YouTube. So if data science is a thing for you, check out the link in the show notes.
There are a bunch of conferences that happened in the spring, and it seems like all the videos are kind of coming out now, which is nice. Some of them from DjangoCon. I still have not figured out if the workshops are going to be shown. I don't think so. But the PyCon US ones are out. And so, yeah, lots of videos to check out up on YouTube right now.
Well, and they could always just listen to the podcast in that case.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so topic-wise, I had a kind of a fun one I wanted to dig into this week. It's phrased as a question. How can you structure your Python script? And I think of it kind of more like just straight up advice, like how should you and what are some best practices and other techniques here. This is a recent Real Python tutorial from a new author on the site, Rohit Goswami. And when I started the podcast, I tried some different questions to ask. I guess at the end of the show, unlike the usual ones you've heard me say over the last, 3 years or so. But the question was, what is something you thought you knew about Python but were wrong about? So like kind of misconceptions people have as they started their Python journey. And so almost everybody I would talk to would be in Python way longer than me because I was just starting at it. And that was one of the reasons I like doing the show. And the only problem with that question is I kept getting the same answer. And so that's why I kind of retired it. The answer that was 10 times running was, I thought Python was a scripting language or only a scripting language. And that actually speaks a lot to Python's growth, but also to their growth as developers using the language. And what I got interested by, I come into Python at this stage, 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and I'm doing much more stuff with data science. And I'm also looking at web applications and I'm looking at these other kinds of things. And I wasn't purely writing more script-like things. And so I didn't really get sort of doused in how to do that properly. And man, this is a great resource for that. And it's still really common. And so even as much as I wondered about those early uses and how should you properly create a standalone script and what are sort of best practices, I had seen them floating around and there were common things that you would see used inside them. So again, I think this will be really good. These techniques are designed to, how can you make it be more reproducible, more shareable, and what are other things you need to think about as you prepare a script? So some of the things you need to think about as far as organizing your script, a common one, in fact, we even have an entire tutorial and video course on this one, is this thing called the shebang line, which is in Linux and Mac OS. You can make your Python script directly executable from the command line, so you don't have to type Python and then the name of the script. You can just sort of execute the script itself. And it's this thing that has like a hashtag, the number sign. What are the other things that people call this thing? Octothorpe, I think, is the other name. And then a exclamation point, which is the bang. So hash bang or shebang. It then includes the path to where your Python interpreter is installed. And like I said, we have an entire tutorial on that, so I'm not going to spend much time on that, but that's a common thing you see in scripts to kind of make it easier for someone else to run it. This tutorial goes into then setting up the initial script, creating an entry point, things that you should think about, like, well, how should I structure this? Should I use named constants for clarity? How to integrate your external libraries and dependencies? This is where things have gotten a lot better. Some new standards have come out here. This sort of inline script dependencies is part of it, which is nice. The inline metadata, it uses a standard of PEP 723. We've talked about it a bunch. In fact, we talked about it when we talked about Marimo notebooks, which kind of act like a script, if you will. There's a whole area about how to handle command line arguments. Many scripts will run as a command line interface, and so some advice there. Ways to improve how your data would be represented to make it a little more structured, using the advantages that these other things that go beyond the basic Python types, things like an enum, if you have fixed choices, data classes and name tuples. And man, we've talked about all these things across episodes and so forth, and have and good news. There's if you have questions on that stuff, RealPython has dedicated tutorials and video courses on all that stuff. So if you want to learn more about how should I use an enum or a data class, a name tuples, and it just sort of is tying a lot of this advice together, which I liked. Another useful section is talking about showing feedback from your script. Yes, you can use print functions, but maybe you would want to use logging. Why would you want to probably do that? And then including assert statements to check for consistency. And of course, one of our favorites, maybe using the rich library to add some structure and color to the terminal interface for the output also. There's an example script across this whole thing. It reads in some data, which is a nice touch as scripts are popular in data science also. Actually, that's probably one of the more popular places you might see them today. The idea of like, okay, well, how do I add that in there and where should that go? The code is shown across every section and indicates things with highlighting, which I like as a feature on RealPython. We've done that quite a bit, and it sure makes the thing more scannable. Like, okay, what am I adding here and plugging in? Often I would see a lot of tutorials out there that just show you the entire code again. And you're like, okay, well, what's new here? And you're having to like think about it. I like that. They've added a quiz, which is really nice to test your skills. And so, yeah, across the board, I think this is a really great place to start. Again, it's funny to go full circle and think about like, okay, well, yeah, it can be a scripting language, if you will. And it's a useful tool for that. And it again depends what you're trying to build. So nice work on this, Rohit. I think a lot of people get a lot out of this tutorial.
So I always assumed that the SH in shebang was for shell because it's at the part of a top shell script.
Yeah.
So while you were talking, I looked it up. And evidently another name for that hash is a sharp, as in like music, sharps.
Oh, I like that better.
And the SH it's sharp bang is where that comes from. So anyways, thanks there, Wikipedia.
Thanks.
Programmers, we love the esoteric little, yes, technically correct type answers. So there you go.
Yeah.
Anyhow, every year at PyCon US, there's a follow-on mini conference for core contributors called the Python Language Summit. This is where deeper conversations happen about the future of your favorite language. And at the summit, there are a series of talks and then conversations on a variety of topics. For each of these tops, a blog post gets created, and the set of those posts just recently was made available. So the talks this year were as follows. How can we make breaking changes less painful? An uncontentious talk about contention, state of free-threaded Python, fearless concurrency, challenges of the steering council, updates from the Python docs editorial board, PEP 772 packaging governance process, Python on mobile next steps, what do Python core developers want from Rust, and upstreaming the Pyodide JS FFI. Random acronyms there for you.
Yeah.
On top of that, there were also a series of lightning talks. I'm going to touch briefly on two of these, the update on free-threaded Python and a particular lightning talk that's kind of been making the rounds on the internet. As you're probably aware, Python's in the process of trying to get rid of the GIL, that's the global interpreter lock, a mechanism that makes sure that there are no race conditions with memory management in the interpreter. This lock's there for safety, but it also limits the amount of concurrency you can get out of your code. The removal of the GIL is a multi-release process, and the steering committee has made it clear that they can back out at any point if the performance cost of the changes become too great. Core developer Matt Page gave a rundown on the progress since the last language summit in 2024. There's actually been a fair amount of performance improvement. In 3.13, free-threaded mode, which is experimental, was about 40% slower than the regular Python. In the current beta for Python 3.14, it's about 10% difference. So that's pretty good. And some of the platforms are better than others. This is all a work in progress, so they're hoping to squeeze out a bit more performance as they go along. Performance is about more than just speed, though. There's also an increase in memory usage of about 20%, but they haven't started optimizing on this yet, so they're hoping that they can get that down. Overall, the architecture looks promising, with some of the worst-case changes that they were hoping weren't required not being required. And some of the key parts like lists and dicts are fully free-threaded compatible, but there's still a lot of work left to be done in the standard library to get everything else there. On the downside, the underlying code is a little more complex, and this raised some concerns and conversations about the maintainability of the interpreter. The already hardcore folks may need to be a little more hardcore, but the good news is most of this higher level complexity is fairly well contained. So most folks who are playing with this don't actually have to touch those parts. The rest of the post actually documents the conversation that happened after the talk. As an aside, PEP 779 got approved this week, which means that the free threaded mode is no longer considered experimental and will be a supported part of the build in 3.14. Of course, this doesn't mean it's production ready, and it still may not become the default in the future, but this is another step along the journey. The other talk I wanted to highlight was a lightning talk by Guido. If you're new to Python, Guido's the guy who wrote the original interpreter and still actively participates and maintains and the guidance of the language, etc. The talk was titled, "Is Worse is Better Still Better?" Besides being a bit of a mouthful, it's about the fact that when Python first came out, getting something out there was more important than getting it perfect. Guido comments, over the years, every single thing where I took a shortcut was eventually fixed. For example, dictionary hashing has been rewritten twice. Getting the language out there was key to getting other people involved, which is one of the reasons Python grew the way it did. Now that things are a little more settled, there's a process in place. PEPs are examined intently, prototypes are necessary, and all that has to happen before something makes it into a release. This change is because of stability. Nobody wants the next version to fall over. The downside of that is it's harder to get new folks to roll up their sleeves and contribute. He didn't get into this, but that kind of echoes that last point with the increased complexity as a result of the free threaded work, right? Because it kind of raises a bit of a gate for new contributors.
Yeah.
There were no suggestions from this talk. It was more just sort of pointing out how things had changed and trying to get folks at the Language Summit to think about how maybe they can reinvigorate some of the thirst from the early days without putting Python at risk.
Yeah, I would imagine that's happened a lot across the language. Just how companies are using it. Can we change this? Can we modify?
And it's not just the language, right? Like this is a natural consequence of human endeavor, right?
Sure.
You see it with startups when you got 4 or 5 people in a garage doing something, you don't need as much structure. You don't have to think about it as much. And then when you've got a 100-person company, some of that has to happen. And, when you've got a large popular language, we want to make sure we're not breaking things for people. And that kind of entails slowing down, but it can make people wistful for the days where they didn't have to be as slow.
The picture that's accompanying the article is one of the larger groups I think I've seen for the Language Summit, but again, that's just me kind of eyeballing this across the years. Of course, COVID has made things really interesting. The United States have been interesting this year. So, I don't know. But yeah, it looks like there's even more contributors than before.
Yeah, and just, these blogs are like, these are sort of summaries of those conversations. So they tend to be quick and easy reads. It's not like somebody pontificating, and it really is, it's not quite a transcript. It's sort of just a quick summary of what was there. So if you're interested in what's going on in these kinds of situations and the kinds of things that get talked about that, impact the future of the language, there's some good reading in there.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, when I looked at this next topic, I thought to myself, oh, okay, this is kind of like a snarky title, but there's quite a bit of news in the industry as far as LLMs are concerned. And when I saw the title, 5 non-LLM software trends to be excited about, I thought, oh, okay, well, this is maybe coming from a different angle. But actually, this is on a blog titled Engineers Codex. I went to dig to find a name, and I could not find a name given anywhere. There's an email and other spots that just use Engineers Codex. But that made me look through the site and see the other types of stuff that's written on there. And much of it is around LLMs and other things that are happening, newsy types of stuff and industry analysis. And those are the type of articles on it. But it's a really well thought out piece. It touches on a bunch of stuff that we have talked about across, the last 3 or 4 years that are kind of under the radar stuff that, hey, there is other development happening beyond just LLMs. And so that's kind of, I think, interesting to discuss. It also provides some additional links for you to dig in deeper if you want to pursue this stuff. So of these 5 things, the first couple, I think, are the ones that I find most interesting. The very first one is local first software. And I'll just read it from the piece. Local first software prioritizes storing and processing data on a user's local device rather than relying solely on remote servers. So what's changed? Man, your phone is a massive computer now in terms of what it can do, an iPad or other things like that. And so there's a lot of things that could happen on that local device. And there are reasons for that, which include privacy. He links to a piece on this blog titled Ink and Switch. Their title for their piece is Local First Software, subtitle, You Own Your Data in Spite of the Cloud. It lists a bunch of ideals of this. I don't want to call it a movement, but maybe this is the ideals of local first generally. No spinners, your work at your fingertips. Your work is not trapped on one device. The network is optional. Seamless collaboration with your colleagues. The long now. Security and privacy by default. And you retain ultimate ownership and control, which I think are good trends in this idea. And it is maybe against some of the other trends in other parts of the industry, which I think are interesting. And I feel like it's breaking away from REST a little bit in some ways. Ideals that have been at the forefront for a long time. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Like, if you look at the long-term history of computing, this is a cyclic thing in our industry.
Okay.
So
yeah.
You started out with mainframes where you had to go to a room, and then it shifted towards everyone's got a computer on their desk. And then we started to use the computers on your desk, started to move towards like thinner clients or using them in order to remote into virtual machines on other people's servers.
Right.
So there's always this sort of tug of war between centralized control, which has the advantages of, one sysadmin can manage all of it, but then you've got, the networks in the way, to fully decentralized control, which puts all sorts of power at your fingertips, but then you're limited by the device, right? So there's always this back and forth of trying to figure out how to do both those directions, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny because it used to be about the device's power, because the thing in the back rooms was always more powerful.
Yeah.
And that's started to level out. Now that we've got, more power in our pocket than, a supercomputer from 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
That has, it's become more about things like, what do I own? What don't I own?
Yeah.
How long am I waiting for something? Right. So this has always been a bit of a tug of war. And I think this, this movement is just trying to shift it back towards the decentralized mechanism.
So there's a big issue with that, and it has to do with conflicting data and the resolution of that data. And so that it actually goes into like 5 different methodologies. I won't cover them all. I'll read a couple to you that I think are interesting. One is CRDTs, conflict-free replicated data types. That's a mouthful. Again, from the piece, CRDTs are data structures designed to be merged automatically and deterministically without conflicts. They use mathematical principles to ensure that no matter the order in which changes are applied, all replicas will eventually converge to the same state. So these are for things like collaborative apps, like text editors, shared to-do lists, or other systems where things may be frequently updated offline. I think of that like I use a note-taking app, and I use it across a computer, a phone, and an iPad, depending on where I'm using stuff. And so having that kind of way of updating those things and thinking about changes. If some of that piqued your interest, there are links again from that blog you mentioned earlier, Ink and Switch, that go into it a little bit further. The piece mentions briefly operational transforms, which are commonly used in collaborative text editors, something like Google Docs. Another methodology is last write wins. 3-way merging. This is inspired by version control systems like Git. And the method involves maintaining a base version of the data along with the changes from different devices. If conflicts are detected, the system attempts to merge them or prompts the user, hey, how should I resolve this? Event sourcing is the last one that's mentioned. And instead of storing the current state, the series of events that led to that state are stored by the system. And the system can replay events to determine the most accurate or meaningful resolution. So something to think about, which is interesting here, as far as like, okay, well, how do we have the correct version at the end of all of this?
And it's funny, like, again, this is one of those changes that over time, so in the early days of mobile development, this was something we concerned ourselves with a lot because the user might not be on a high fidelity network link.
Right.
So there were things that you only wanted to let them do on Wi-Fi because data plans were expensive or whatever. And so again, if it was collaborative, you had this, someone may have touched the data, but it doesn't actually reach the server until an hour later, and someone else might have touched the data in the meantime. And so as the data access has become more ubiquitous, we haven't had to worry about that as much. But then now more collaboration is happening, so people are starting to worry about it again, right? So we've got these cycles within these cycles.
Yeah. So the next one, as far as the big theme happening, is WebAssembly. And I heard about this really early on in doing the show, so like 5 years ago. People were really, really excited. And I'm like, well, how can I learn more about this? And boy, has it come to fruition, not only across the industry, but across Python. And this also kind of relates to some of the things that we talked about here with this idea of local first, this idea, I feel like it's parallel in some ways, that you're running things in a user's browser for a lot of different tasks that you could do. It actually ties together with the next one, which is interesting, this idea of, okay, well, what do you do with data? And SQLite being in the browser as opposed to the choice of other databases that they were using for web apps before. And it opens up some interesting possibilities for offline functionality with that. The piece actually mentions that Notion, which is a very popular note-taking app, it uses WASM SQLite, which is really interesting to me. WASM supports caching compiled code. That's one of the complaints that people had with some of the Python implementations of some of this stuff, that it takes quite a while to get it, but it can be cached so that subsequent runs are much quicker. The next section, I guess, as I said, comes from the previous one and is talking about SQLite's sort of renaissance. Most developers, when thinking about what databases to use, think about MySQL, Postgres, Relational, Mongo, or Dynamo for NoSQL. And many production grade applications, it may be a good idea to use one of those for your foundation, but it's not always going to be necessary. Kent Dodds argues that you could probably just use SQLite in production. And this actually kind of goes back to that local first thing. When I started to look at doing iOS development, I learned, SQLite is used for most of your applications. There's probably, I don't know how many versions of it on your phone across there. And we've talked about it before, and I think your course goes into it, right? That you did a SQLite course. We talked about some of the advantages there. The zero latency of it, simplified setup, easy multi-instant replication. It can handle pretty big databases, more than you might think, and it's easier to test with in ways and maybe to develop with because it's just a file, which is really nice. And there's a kind of a funny quote that he has in here. This is from the founder of SQLite. Think of SQLite not as a replacement for Oracle, but as a replacement for fopen. And so the idea, it's just a file. I mentioned Notion earlier. Notion implemented SQLite caching in their desktop apps in 2021, and it resulted in a 50% faster initial page loads and 50% faster navigation between pages, and they include charts for that. Cross-platform is the next one, that it's getting better. Cross-platform being between iOS and Android. This actually kind of came up, something I was looking at today. There's a new version of iOS. I guess that's just even like a week or week and a half ago, talking about their new design language, and things like Flutter and React Native have already figured out ways that they're going to try to do the same thing so they'll look the same also. But generally, cross-platform development is getting better, which is nice. That's one of the tricks here. Like, are you going to make something that is running natively, or are you going to make something that runs in the web? And now we have this other idea of like, well, maybe it could run in the phone's browser. Lots of interesting stuff kind of happening here. So the last thing I'll read from the article again, this is something called automated reasoning. Automated reasoning is a bit more obscure, but also super exciting. Automated reasoning focuses on using logic and mathematical proofs to make sure that systems behave as intended, unlike traditional testing, which validates system behavior in specific scenarios. Automated reasoning allows engineers to verify correctness across all possible scenarios. Basically, it's a shift from reactive testing to proactive verification, leading to ideally better reliability and security. So again, you can learn a little bit more about it. It's just sort of giving you a heads up as to one of these ideas. I had not heard of that one. And hey, thanks to Engineers Codex for this piece. Nice to see that things are still developing in the shadow of the current main topic of all things technology right now.
LLMs forever.
Yeah. It's time to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It's titled SQLite and SQL Alchemy in Python, moving your data beyond flat files. The course is based upon a Real Python article by Doug Farrell. And in the video course, your instructor is my frequent co-host, Christopher Trudeau, and he shows you how to use flat files, such as CSVs for data storage, the basics of relational databases, how to start with the single file format SQLite for data storage, how to use SQL Alchemy in several ways, including core text and core statements, and leading up to how SQL Alchemy can behave as an object relation mapper, or ORM, to work with data as Python objects. I think it's a good investment of your time to learn how Python, SQLite, and SQL Alchemy can give your programs database functionality, allowing you to store data in a single file without the need for a database server, and how an ORM can help you get past needing to learn the intricacies of SQL to start working with data as Python objects. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. All right, so what do you got next?
Well, so when you're building a web project, not everything you do is necessarily web-facing. You might need some tools to help you manage your site, for example. And Django includes a mechanism called a management command, which is a way to write command line scripts that interface with Django. And in fact, the library comes with several of these built in, one for creating a new user and a whole bunch for doing things like database management. The structure of these management commands is a little crufty and tends to contain a fair amount of boilerplate. And so enter this article by the folks at RevSys called Better Django Management Commands with Django Click and Django Typer. So you might be familiar with the command line library Click. It uses decorators to help you manage command line flags and arguments. And as the name implies, Django Click is a wrapper around Click, which is Django Management Command aware. So to introduce you to the library, the article starts out by writing a regular Django management command that imports some data from a JSON file into the database. It then rewrites the command using Django Click instead. A lot of the boilerplate in the management command is about arguments and flags, and since Click deals with these using decorators, you can write a lot less code this way. Their example cuts about 25% of the code, and more importantly, also makes it more readable. The 75% that's left is actually the data loading stuff rather than the finicky flag argument handling things. Django Click also has a neat feature called the lookup utility. So say your command line argument is the ID of a user in your database. You would then have extra code that looks up the user object that goes with that ID. So you can specify this in Django Click itself, and it will automatically look up the value in the database model for you. So this isn't a huge difference, but that's 3 less lines of code you'd have to write for any of these kinds of arguments. And who doesn't want to have 3 less lines of code? Most of the article is actually on Django Click, but at the end it discusses Django Typer as well. This library uses type annotations instead of decorators to do similar things to what I just talked about. The last example modifies that same command and uses the type mechanisms instead. So if you prefer type annotations over decorators, you've got some choice here. If you're writing a lot of Django management commands, you should definitely check one or the other of these libraries out. It could save you a fair amount of coding.
Nice. So we have a discussion this week. I'll just introduce the title of it, and then I'll let you kind of dig into it a little bit. But it's Advice for Time Management as a Manager. It's from Ben Kun on his blog. And I like the first line. I'll just read it. Welcome to being a manager! ! Your time management problem just got a lot harder. One of the funny things I want to just mention briefly is I have not seen the use of IC. And so I had to like think about it for a second as an abbreviation. I'm like, oh, individual contributor. And so that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of the place this is coming from a little bit, kind of a little more corporate-y in some ways. So yeah, what do we got here?
So Ben starts out by pointing out that when you're an individual contributor, your time management philosophy basically boils down to deciding what's most important and then working on that until it's done. And then you decide what's next most important and just sort of loop.
Right.
That's a bit of an oversimplification, but we'll come back to that in a second. Once you start doing team lead kinds of responsibilities, or in fact, any role where you're dealing with more people, this starts to fall apart as your work becomes more interrupt driven. And depending on your role, you might be still writing code, but also doing things like one-on-ones, leading design conversations, doing code reviews, managing up, and more. So although the article focuses on the manager stuff, you don't necessarily have to have reports to get into this problem.
Yeah.
And the result is often that it isn't obvious what the single most important thing is. And so the rest of this doc, which he originally wrote as an internal document at one of the companies he was at to give people honest advice, it essentially just sort of says, here are some ways of tackling this shift from leave me alone to code to now I've got all these things I have to handle. He breaks it down into a few parts. The first is called have accurate expectations for yourself. The second is prioritize ruthlessly. The third, which I love, is unemploy your future self. And fourth is the carve out focused time. So what did you think about this?
I thought about it kind of in multiple ways. Like I've joked about this a bunch of times that I always kind of seem to drift into a management role, which I think is across a lot of people I've met. I'm definitely one of these people that have a more wide background as far as like things that I've been interested in and areas I've worked in, worked in sales, worked in this, worked in programming, and I've tried to have my own sort of business. And that definitely led me into a lot of these ideas. Most of my work right now is autonomous and I get it done. And it was hard initially when even just like thinking about like, okay, starting your own business, you kind of are like your own manager suddenly, which is kind of wild. And I was, doing like this sort of consultancy stuff for small businesses and helping them develop software. But just being at home in your own office and not having to go to an office and then having to think like, okay, well, how am I going to get work done? How am I going to avoid all these other distractions and these other to-do list stuff that like you think of in your normal life? And I think remote work piled that into a lot of other people's lives too. So they suddenly had to become managers of their own lives because now suddenly home life is really kind of clawing into, this other life, which is interesting. The other part that related to me, and maybe we'll dive into it a little bit more, is that I've had to do, more of this. Like I have a very split sort of life right now where I do the podcast and then I do all my sort of video course work. And that is much more management. You do have to shift your priorities. You have to think about, okay, well, in order for other people to get things done, I need to make sure that stuff's not in their way. And this idea of like, I hate the term blockers. Hey, are there any blockers for you today? This is something that is brought up, weekly in our meetings here. Yeah. I mean, there's people that could be waiting on my review of something and therefore they're at like a stop point and they can't move forward. And it's very project managey, kind of terminology as far as management, or they're waiting on other people's work for stuff to move forward. And so, we call our process a pipeline. It's very much that. We use Trello and other tools like that to kind of get things done. But it's interesting to think about. One thing that you didn't mention that I liked in here is he does have a checklist that I thought was kind of nice. The help, I'm overwhelmed checklist, which has a handful of things that kind of can maybe help you within an organization. Some of them you can do yourself. Many of them involve literally reaching out to somebody else to help you triage these to-do lists and think about stuff. I've had less of that in this particular work, but that has been helpful. One of the things I've been trying to figure out recently, and actually you were helping me talk about it the other day, is like, well, how do I figure out, like, this hasn't been a problem for me, but I feel like I've been dodging bullets this whole time, but figuring out how to continue doing work if I'm sick and, maybe not able to be around for, a week or something like that. That hasn't really come up in my particular case, but I know that that's an inevitability. And so I have to think about, okay, well, how do I hand this off and manage that sort of stuff? And I need to communicate that. So I don't know. My thoughts are scrambled, sorry, but it's a good piece. And I think it's useful to think about some of these things, and maybe I'll bounce off some of your ideas too.
Well, I was actually going to mention that checklist. I think it's really, really important. The items on it are: start by booking time with your manager or your stakeholder to get your priorities understood, make a list of everything on your plate, delegate as much as possible, understand how much you're actually going to be able to get done, and then notify anyone who isn't going to get their stuff done because they're below that cutoff. And this was sort of my playbook. For about a decade, I was cleanup manager. I had several different jobs where I was come in to sort of fix a department. It was kind of like if Silicon Valley, the TV show, and Up in the Air, the movie, had a baby.
So not Leon the Professional? You're not that, that kind
Almost.
of cleaner?
There's a little bit of that too. And unfortunately, I don't have Clooney's looks or charm, so it didn't go over as cleanly. But a big part of this really was, I found, just going in and going, all right, where's the to-do list? Like, what does the department have to do? We need to know what the jobs are we're going to be tracking, and how many of them can we do at a time, because we've got multiple people working on it. And then how realistic is the list, right? So, and there's constantly this dynamic of, well, someone wants to add something to the list. So what's the process of doing that? Who are we talking with, right? And making that process as transparent as possible, whether it's your own to-do list and managing your manager saying, hey, you just asked me to do this thing, but I'm doing these other 5. Is this more important than those other 5?
Right.
Or whether you're a team lead and you're dealing with multiple people, the problem is the same. And my favorite trick with this is, particularly when you've got 2 different stakeholders both coming to you, playing good cop, bad cop, or whatever it is they're doing, is anytime there's any sort of debate, you get them in the room and make them make the decision, right? So somebody comes in and says, this is the most important thing. I'm like, okay, well then I'm working on this other thing that's on the front burner right now. You and the person who owns that task have to sit down and agree that I have to stop this. And 90% of the time they go, well, when can I have it done? Because they don't want to have that conversation, right? So just having that list and having it known, everyone knowing what is on that list and how we're working through things, makes a huge difference. It's a simple little thing, but it makes a big, big difference. And the other part, it's on this checklist, and he talks about it elsewhere in the article as well. So if you are entering the team lead space, delegate as much as possible is really, really important. I don't care how much smarter you are than every other person in the room, you don't scale. And this is one of the hardest things.
Not without burnout.
This is one of the hardest things that new managers have to learn, right? When you go from being an individual contributor, you go, oh, I'll just work harder. Well, there's only so many hours in the week. And so learning how to let some of that go. And sometimes that means things not getting done the way you would have done them, because they're going to get done, as long as they're still high enough quality, having it done some other way, so be it, because otherwise you're just not going to, you're not going to get as much done, because more people doing it is, going to be more productive than just you on your own.
This is something that my wife dealt with quite a bit. She was brought into a management role. She was really having a hard time with the culture inside that company, partly because they never fired anyone. And so the idea of management is saying more needs to get done. We are not meeting these quotas. We're not getting things done. You are the new person in this role. Here's a bunch of vice grip pressure on you. How do I pass that on to the other people? And unfortunately, she did not enjoy that part, trying to push these people, and ended up just taking it all on herself and doing a lot of the work herself. And it's just like, you're just going to blow up in that position, which is really
Yeah.
hard. I don't know what the solution is there.
I had a friend in a similar situation, and it took her about 3 years to get the department in shape. And essentially, all she did was turn up the expectations in the department. And although they weren't allowed to fire, they were allowed to do things like cross train. Oh, you don't seem to be really invested in doing this. Is there something at the company that you're more interested in?
There you go.
And so you start using your education budget to get people out of the department. And, as people move just generally, because, shifts happen, people go to another office or quit or whatever, you bring in higher caliber people as the replacements, and eventually you'll get there.
Yeah.
But if you're not allowed to actually chop heads, this can take quite some time.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to push for that. I mean, obviously, we're living in a time, especially in the technological world, where it feels like the chopping is just random, and it's like, okay, we just need to get rid of a quote unquote percentage, and it doesn't even need to be about output. It's just like a stock market thing. Here it was like, these projects need to be done, and I can't seem to get people to like do fundamental stuff. So it's interesting. Like, I think that's a hard part. Like, I'd like to see a course that talks a little bit more about that, like empathy for the manager kind of thing, and like how to keep your sanity. But yeah, I mean, delegating is a huge part of it, especially in the types of things that I've been doing lately. I always kind of think it's interesting to think about like just self-management, like being on top of that sort of stuff. And there is some advice at the end of the piece, some additional articles and so forth to kind of think about like, okay, tools for keeping focused, tracking your time, which I've played with, which is an interesting tool. I know there's people that, man, that's the way their brain is wired together. They want to track everything they do and look at these metrics. It's kind of like the workout kind of people that, want to track everything about what they're doing in their life. And that works for them. And so maybe that's something that works for you also. But I've definitely not been that person time tracking wise. It's a nice piece to think about here.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, even if you're not a manager, particularly in these days where like you got small teams and a lot of the agile type stuff, everyone's doing code reviews for each other, and everyone's doing right. So even if you don't have reports, there's more of a time management. The days of being left alone to write code are fewer and further between. So there's definitely some good ideas in here to how to help manage that and how to think about it and make sure that you are properly dealing with the multiple stakeholder problem, which is quite common nowadays.
Yeah. And I mean, remote stuff definitely has changed the level of communications and the types of communications that are happening. So, well, I think that takes us into projects. I wanted to cover this one. It's something that's in beta, but I thought it would be interesting, especially for our audience, something they may want to keep an eye out on. The project I'm going to talk about is Positron. This is from Posit. Posit creates all kinds of tools that are out there. I've mentioned before their support across the industry. They kind of, I think, originally were known as like the R people, the R Studio people, and Shiny, and other things that they've done, and they've kind of rebranded to Posit. I'll read this from their GitHub page. Positron is a next-generation data science IDE built by Posit PBC. Positron is built on Code OSS, and this is something fascinating. I'll talk more about it in a second. But to learn about the basic features like command settings, using source control, and more, check out the VS Code documentation. I was like, what? Okay, so Code OSS is basically Microsoft's VS Code repo where they've developed it with the community. The source code is available to everyone under the standard MIT license. And so I was wondering, and I watched their video presentation about this announcement video they had at PositConf 2024 about 7 months ago. They talk about it, and one of the other tools that's built on top of Code OSS is Cursor AI, their editor. The idea here is that they were getting many, many requests from the community for our studio to add, hey, why don't you add this? Why don't you add this? And they were all kind of in the IDE type direction. And they thought to themselves, well, maybe we should not try to bolt all that stuff on this platform, but look at a different way to start from the bottom up and or even have a nice foundation to begin with, VS Code has so much of that. And a lot of developers who are getting into data science are familiar with it because it is open source and it's free. People can play with it. So a little more about positron. It's an extensible polyglot tool for writing code and exploring data. It can work with Python and R and other languages potentially, I think. It's a familiar environment for reproducing and authoring and publishing. In the video, they show off a lot of this stuff. It has a lot more data science-y features. It has RStudio type window panes for like things like you can look at your session, which would include your variables and other stuff like that. A help pane that can show docs. Plots pane, which has nice controls for layouts, includes controls for like exporting those plots as you're working on them and building them up. Viewer pane, which is kind of like a browser pane in some ways with interactive HTML. So you can kind of see stuff that you're standing up that is designed for the web and has HTML components. You can see how that's going to render. It's still in beta, but it seems very usable. I did install it. I had only a few minutes to kind of play with it, but you should be able to hit the ground running if you played with VS Code and you're interested in looking at something that is a little more data sciencey. And I hope to talk to somebody about this a little further. Maybe I'll reach out to Posit and get somebody on the show. What's your project?
I've got something called Aho Karasik RS, and I'm probably not saying that right. If, like me, that term is meaningless to you, it's a multi-term search algorithm for strings. So say you want to look for not just hello, but hello and a world in a body of text. This library is something that helps you do that. The project's part of a collection by a group of folks calling themselves G Research, and it looks like the primary contributor is Itamar Turing-Trauring from Python Speed, who we've mentioned many times on the show before. He writes some great stuff.
Yeah.
The RS part of the project name is because this is a wrapper to a Rust library. There is a Python-only version of the same algorithm, but as you might expect, the Rust version is 50 to 70% faster. To use the library, you pass in a series of patterns, then call those on a haystack of text to be examined. You can get results either as an iterator of tuples, giving you location information, or as a list of found patterns. The library works on both strings and bytes, which is interesting, as a lot of these kinds of text searching tools are limited to just strings. And you can also configure how patterns get matched, varying the order of how the matches show up and whether the patterns can overlap and a lot of that kind of stuff. So this allows you to do things that are hard in regexes. So if you deal with a lot of string matching, then this one might be right for you.
Yeah. It makes me think a little bit about fuzzy stuff that I've seen before, sort of fuzzy matching. I think it's a little more specific than that.
Yeah, I don't think this does fuzzy. I think it's specific matching. But the idea being that, like, if you're looking for multiple things, you can build a regex that does that, where that gets really ugly if it's possible for the text to overlap. And so you want to look for something, and it might also be a substring of one of the things that you want to look up as well. That can get messy, and so this helps you out. So if that's your use case, then worth checking out.
Yeah, I think of this often. An analogy would be like, okay, you're gonna do a Google type search or whatever search engine search, and you use the qualifier site : and then just search inside this website instead of across the entire web. So like, hey, just search within this type of string for this type of thing. And I could see how that would be. It's definitely going to find the more of the results you're looking for as opposed to less.
Depending on your use case. Yeah. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to mention that Michael Kennedy was kind enough to have me on Talk Python again.
Yeah.
We had a deep conversation about some of the plugins and ecosystem around polars. So if you're thinking about doing polars, or you're interested in some of the other libraries that are out there that you can use if you're writing polars and you're not tired of listening to me yammer, then give it a listen.
Yeah. Lots of resources there again. That's great. All right. Well, thanks, Christopher, for bringing all these PyCoders goodies this week. Again, if anybody wants to submit stuff, we'll include a link. Again, we're cautiously optimistic that we'll get some good stuff this summer, but we always need some submissions from you. Thanks again, Christopher, for coming on the show. It's great to talk to you.
Always fun to be here.
I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.